All right, I have my things together here, everything that I need. I've got my see-through ruler, I've got my zipper foot, I've got my Sharpie or a pencil, scissors, and my busk. And there's the loop side and the knob side to the busk, and I can put this aside for a minute. I then have my 4 corset fronts. Now some patterns require that you cut one front and one facing for each side, for the left and the right. I always cut 2 fronts. I just like the finish of it better rather than having a facing piece, which would be narrower. And I'm going to pick this up because we have to determine which is the right side of the body. And I want the beige side to be my outside. I want the beige side to be the shell and the gray side to be the lining. And the loops always go on the right side of the body, on the right hand side of the body. And we always start with the loop side of the busk. And that's why it's important to determine which of your front panels is the right hand side of the panel. So I figured that out. My 2 pieces, my 2 fronts, are right sides together. So that's the right sides or the bright sides or the sides where you can most easily see the weave. I'm going to do this. So this is the bottom and this is the top. This is the wrong side of my lining. And I'm going to mark the center front. Now on this piece, the center front happens to go from point to point. So we have a center front at the bottom, a center front at the top, and it doesn't hurt to put a little T at the top. Just because if you're not used to these pattern pieces, it's sometimes hard to tell. So I have my center front, and now I'm marking 1/2 inch from the top and 1/2 inch from the bottom. So this 1/2 inch mark indicates where my binding will go. So my binding will be stitched along here because I use 2-inch wide binding and it ends up being a 1/2 inch finished binding. If you're using a different width of binding, then you will need to make your marking at a different spot, possibly at 3/8 or 1/4 inch. Once I have that done, I can take my loop busk, the loop side of my busk, and I'm going to try and hold that up for you. And I'm going to center it. I'm going to center it between those 2 lines. So I've centered it between the top and bottom line because I don't want the busk in the area that I'm going to sew the binding. I won't be able to sew the binding on if we put it there. And I'm going to mark the location of each of these loops. So I have something that looks like this. And I know I need to sew right from the top to the first gap, that first mark, and then back stitch, and then leave an opening and stitch along here. So I have my loop placements, and now I'm going to go and sew this seam. All right, so we're at the sewing machine, and I'm just going to start stitching. And I back stitch at that opening, raise my foot, and I'm putting the needle down right at the other side of that gap, doing a few stitches forward, a few stitches back. And I've got that line to guide me so that I know exactly where I'm supposed to be stitching. So if you have any difficulty sewing a straight line, you shouldn't be worried about it because you are going to sew right on the line that you have drawn. Accuracy is important here because if the loop openings are too big, the loops of the busk start to come through. And if the loops are too small, the loop openings are too small, then the loops won't fit through the holes. And I'm sewing right to the end and then back stitching. And I can take that out. And there you can see that I've sewn, but I've left the openings. I did not sew through the loop openings where they're marked. So you can see it's only the drawing, it's not the stitching. And these loops will fit into place there. Now I'm going to finger press this opening. I'm just going to finger press that, though if I was actually making a corset for real, I would be taking it to the iron. It's really important to press everything before you work on it. Now I'm just going to slide these loops through the opening in the seam allowance. And you may look at these seam allowances and think they're huge, and they are. I like my front seam allowances extra wide so that I can put a bone casing in here if I choose. And that's why I do it that way. It's then important to pull these loops through as far as possible. So you can see that that loop is pulled through so that we're seeing the largest part of that hole. If you end up sewing it like that, where you're only seeing a little bit, you're going to have difficulty putting the busk, attaching it to the other side. So we need that large hole visible because that's where the knob fits in, and then it gets pulled tight against the smaller edge. So at this point I'm going to take it to my machine. I've already put a zipper foot on that machine, and I'm going to finish stitching this side of my busk in. I'm putting the busk under the machine, the corset under the machine, so that the busk is right against the edge of the zipper foot. It's in that groove. So I'm not starting at the end of the corset. I'm starting next to the busk, and then I'm going to back stitch. And that means that I know exactly where that stitching should be. So I'm going to back stitch. And then I'm just pulling my busk through. Some people use pins for this. I'm not in the habit of using pins at all. Now, if you're not experienced at sewing this kind of thing, you're going to want to wear goggles at this point. The reason being, there is a piece of metal right here. Now, if you're sewing carefully, that piece of metal is right next to the foot, and there should be no danger, but it's actually rather amazing what a novice can do. I'm going to back stitch at the end, clip that. So there you can see the busk. It's sewn in. This is the top, this is the bottom. It's going to go on the right side of the body. So now we can move on to the loop side of the busk. All right, so there's the right hand side of my corset busk. Here's the left hand side of my corset. It's going to get sewn like that, folded around, and it will meet that side. So that's what we've got to accomplish. I've already marked my center front as I did on the other side, and I've marked my 1/2 inch mark. So they're there, and now what I have to do is sew from the top here all the way down to the bottom. So I'm going to sew forward, back stitch, sew to the bottom, and back stitch again, and then I will move on to putting my knob side of the busk into place. So I'm just going to sew down this line. I'm going to back stitch a little bit. Back stitch at the other end. And again, I'm just going to finger press it open. Though again, really what you want to do is use a nice hot iron to press this flat and then press it closed. And in fact, I think I probably will press this with an iron, otherwise we're not going to get a nice crease. So I'm just going to go press this with an iron and I will be back. Right, so I've taken this and I've pressed it because I want a nice firm crease along that edge. Because ultimately, they're going to go like this. But what's important is that I top stitch or edge stitch right carefully along that edge. And I'm doing that so that when the corset is on the body and it's under pressure, we don't get that little opening. We're going to have the two corset sides stay butt close together so we don't get a gap, which can be really unattractive. If you see a dark corset, you sometimes see a strip of skin showing through. If you have a white corset, sometimes you might have something dark underneath. So it's really important that these stay, even when it's done up, really close together. And to do that, I'm just going to edge stitch along here. So I'm just going to get my machine going again. Right, so I have my corset front under the machine and I want a scant eighth. So I'm sewing really close to the edge. I've lined the edge of my fabric up with the stripe or the dividing line in my foot, and I've moved my needle as far to the right as possible. So you can see it's a straight line, it's just about an eighth, and that's going to give us just enough. It's not enough to make a difference in the fit of the corset, it won't affect the fit at all, but it will help to keep the two fronts together when they are closed and on the body. So I have my right front with the loops and I have my left front that now has this little edge along it. And I need to mark the placement of my knobs. So I'm taking my right front and I'm going to make sure that this edge, which I wish I had pressed it with an iron because it isn't as smooth, so I do recommend that you always use an iron, but that edge is going to line up not on the edge of the corset, but on the edge of that stitch line. And that is where I'm going to line it up. So I'm making sure that my top and bottom are lined up where they should be, and I'm putting the edge, the front edge, right on the stitching. And I'm marking in the smallest part of the loop. Now what I like to do is I like to take my see-through ruler and make sure that all of my spots that I've marked are about the same distance away from my stitching. And if they're not, like this bottom one is not quite, well, maybe it is, they're all pretty much the same distance from the stitching. So I just want to make sure of that so that that's a straight line. It will keep puckering from occurring. So you just want to make sure that that's even because the knobs are going to go through those holes, those marks. And that is going over that. So now I'm going to get an awl and I'm going to poke holes for these knobs. Alright, so I said that I'm going to go and get an awl so that I can poke the holes for the knob side of the busk. And if you don't know what an awl is, here are 3 different types of awls, and this one is clearly quite well used. It's not my favorite. It gets too wide. This one gets too narrow, and this one is just right. However, this one is from the hardware. These 2 are sewing awls, but oddly enough, they don't tend to work as well. Again, because one is too wide, one doesn't get wide enough. So the hardware awl is the one that I've found to be the best. So how do we do this? An awl can be a scary tool to use. Now, typically, I go through both layers of coutil, the seam allowance and the coutil layer, but you don't have to. You could just go through the top layer, but I'm going to go through both. So I'm lining this up, and I can feel it and I can see it against that hole. And I just start twisting. This is when it's not going to work. And sometimes you need to start with a smaller one. And that's okay. So the smaller one is force the hole through. And as you can see, it's parting the fibers. It's not tearing them, it's just parting them. So I've got a hole there, and then I'm going to put the larger awl in. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Now it looks like I've made a huge hole, but I actually haven't. Because that hole, once I push that through, will shrink around the knob and close in on it. And that's why you use an awl rather than a hole punch. There are instances when you use a hole punch, like when you're working with leather. I also use one when I'm working with wool. So again, I'm going from the underside, I'm finding that spot, I'm making a hole, and you do have to do this one at a time. You can't do all the holes and then push the bust through. You have to do them one at a time. And you have to work fairly quickly, or the hole does start to close up. And I'm just going to continue on with that, and then we'll come back. All right, so I've now finished putting my knobs through the holes in the coutil. And again, I went through both my layers, my seam allowance and my other layer. And I could now use this and sew along here and along here to create a casing for a bone. Or I can now stitch along here and then another row and leave a stitch for a bone. So I do still have to secure this along that edge right next to there, and I'll need a zipper foot for that. But you can see how this works. You don't see the underneath stitching, and I have used stitching that contrasts with the fabric so that you can see the stitching that I've done. But you can see that even when I pull that tightly, you're not seeing anything behind that. It's just created a little lip so that when you pull and put tension on the corset, you're not seeing the skin behind the corset, you're not seeing the shirt underneath it. It is completely hidden. So think of it as a tiny placket, but it's very, very functional. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to put the zipper foot on my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch along this edge, and then I'll be finished my corset application. I'm back at the sewing machine. I have my zipper foot on the machine. I've made sure that my needle is back in the center position. That's really important. And again, I have my busk in the groove underneath the zipper foot where the zipper teeth would normally fit. I'm starting with my needle. I'm just going to put the needle down so that I know it's in the right spot. And then I'm going to back stitch. And then I will just keep going forward. And the busk is complete. I can set my pieces up. And there we are. The busk is completely finished. So this concludes the basic or most common busk application technique. And that's it for today. I'm Linda Sparks, and I hope you've learned something from this video today and will consider viewing some of the other videos that we're doing. I'm the owner of Farthingales here in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. We're an online store for corset making supplies, so you can find anything that we've used today on our website, and that's www.farthingalescorsetmakingsupplies.com. You can also find our product at Vogue Fabrics in Evanston, Illinois, and they also have a website, voguefabricsstore.com. So again, I hope you've enjoyed the video, I hope you've learned something, and I hope that you'll check in again. Thanks for watching.